Welcome back, folks. Day 2 of natural selection coming at you right now. So we finished with this slide here, and I'll get to the writing if you didn't finish writing it from the last class. But when you go off to a university or another school setting, or even out in the world, a lot of times you'll hear people say, you know, I see evolution happening in the real world. It's a fact. And again, what they're talking about when they say that word evolution is they're really talking about natural selection. They're talking about the small changes within a certain kind of animal that they're seeing. Perhaps, you know, butterfly wing shape or color or something like that. But when we hear the word evolution, we think of the grand story of evolution, you know, going from, you know, amoebas to fish to whatever the heck that is, to monkeys to people. And this is not the same thing. Despite the fact that the scientific community likes to use the word change and evolution for both, they are two completely different processes that take completely different things for them to occur. So for natural selection, you've got mostly rearranging or eliminating genetic information, and that's why you see those changes. But here, for this grand story of evolution to be true, you need an addition of genetic information for it to be true. And it's completely opposite. They are not the same thing. Which is why I had you write this down. And I'll give you some time to do that if you didn't get it yesterday. Whole thing. Again, the main story here is that if you have a small change, like in wing size of a butterfly, and you let that happen over millions and millions of years, all these small changes are adding up, and people might think, well, over that amount of time, maybe you'll end up with some really big changes. Maybe you won't even have a butterfly at the end of that story. Maybe it'll be something completely different. And that's the idea that the scientific community likes to push. So evolution means change. Here is an example of change. Therefore, evolution is a fact. And again, folks, I said this yesterday. If evolution means change, then I would be an evolutionist. It is a fact that creatures change over time. There's no denying that. Nobody denies that. Nobody in their right mind does. You can see it happening in front of us. The real question we have to ask ourselves is this the type of change that will cause the story of evolution to take place, where you start with, you know, some single-celled organism, and over billions of years, you end up with the entire animal kingdom that we see in the world today? And the answer to that question is a resounding no, because the change that we see almost always involves a degeneration of genetic information, or a loss of genetic information. For that grand story of evolution to be true, you need to have additional genetic information being added, over time, and that's not what we ever see. So logical fallacy is what this really is, equivocation. They're pretending that change and evolution are the same thing. They're assigning evolution and change to two completely different processes. And that's really what I'm trying to drive home here. So when you hear this, you got to know that it's deceiving. They're not the same thing. Not all change is the type of change that you would need for evolution to be true. So does evolution mean change? No. It must also account for the origin of radically new traits that are not just modifications to existing ones. And this is where Darwin and many since that time have continually failed. When we see changes in animals that make animals change over time, they're not the kinds of changes that would give you evolution. So we've talked about the Galapagos finches, we've talked about the peppered moths, we can talk about colorful guppies now. But again, these are all the exact same examples, right? There are changes occurring in a population of animals, and that population of animals is better adapted to the environment, and they're passing on that genetic information to their, in this case, little baby guppies. So basically what's going on with the guppies is if you have a whole bunch of guppies, you've got colorful guppies and you've got guppies that are kind of boring. Well, if you have a predator come in and that predator has a lot easier time spotting all the flashy looking ones, then it's going to gobble them all up and you'll just be left with kind of the boring looking guppies. And so then those boring guppies are going to pass their boring traits onto the next generation, and you're going to end up with a lot more guppies that don't look quite as colorful. That's natural selection. But the big issue here is the scientific community, and a lot of times Richard Dawkins, we've heard from him, and we're going to talk more about him. He's a very anti-Christian, anti-creation person. He thinks that it's child abuse to teach people the biblical version of history. So he uses this example, and many like him use that example of evolution happening before our very eyes. And they say it's evolution in action. But again, they're confusing evolution with change. The small changes that we're observing in all these examples are not the types of changes that would have to happen for evolution to be true. Professor John Endler says natural selection must not be equated with evolution, though the two are intimately related. Natural selection is common enough in natural populations to have been detected in a wide variety of organisms, and strong selection is not as rare as had been previously assumed. Natural selection is therefore likely to be important in evolution. However, natural selection does not explain the origin of new variants, only the processes of changes in their frequency. In other words, write all this down. This is kind of a summary of what I'm trying to drill into your minds.
Okay, I do not have that.
It looks like a lot, but it's a pretty big font size, so hopefully it's not too painful.
Source.
Sure. Who's your teacher again?
Insurance.
Okay. Bless you.
Thank you.
I'm just going to go ahead and read this. This is the best way to summarize what I'm trying to get across to you here. Following Darwin's example, evolutionists still like to talk of natural selection as a creative force, but it cannot create anything. So regardless of how often you see examples of natural selection or small changes or microevolution, whatever you want to call it, whenever you see those examples as evidence of evolution, those two things are not related. This whole big story of evolution, of things evolving and changing and branching off of each other over the last 4.5 billion years, has nothing to do with the process of natural selection. Natural selection is a way that you lose genetic information, or at best rearrange it. But the big story of evolution is the opposite. You need to gain information for that. Natural selection can only eliminate the unfit, not create the fit. Natural selection is not the same as evolution. Survival of the fittest does not explain the arrival of the fittest. I really like that quote, and as much as I'd like to take credit for coming up with it, I can't. That was actually from a guy named Hugo de Vries over 100 years ago, said that for the first time. And it's just as true today as it was back then. So what I just kind of want to show you a little bit here is natural selection and this process of species changing in a small way over time. It was not first found out by Darwin. It was figured out by a bunch of other people in the past, actually. The main change that Darwin used with this process was applying it to explain how all of the different animals we see in the world today got here, as opposed to just explaining it with how, creatures change within their kinds over time. So everybody on that list knew about natural selection. They didn't call it that back then, but that idea was not novel with Darwin. Charles Darwin, though, invoked natural selection as a creative force to try and explain an evolutionary view of the origin of all living things. And this is where he differed from his predecessors. But this is also where he failed, because again, natural selection is not creative. So, even though he believed it was a creative force, and a lot of people in his time believed that same thing in the later part of the 1800s, a lot of people on the creation side of the story who believed in the biblical version of history correctly did not believe that natural selection was a creative force. Carl Linnaeus, Edward Blythe, you might have heard of those individuals. They disagreed, along with many other scientists of Darwin's day. But this kind of lays an interesting foundation here, because one of the big things that we oftentimes hear is how science and evolution has disproven the Bible, right? That's the sort of thing that we'll hear in our lives, whether it's on social media or in documentaries or wherever you're getting your information from. Now, one of the reasons that a lot of people thought that evolution disproved the Bible was because of this piece of information here. Many people in Darwin's day used the Latin Vulgate Bible, and they falsely translated the Hebrew word for kind, which the Bible uses, to the word species. So what they thought then is, because the Bible says that animals reproduce according to their kinds, well, if really they reproduce according to their species, that should mean that species do not change over time. And so that gave this idea, fixity of species, a place. So people thought that the Bible taught that species do not change over time. And they used that to say that the Bible was wrong then, because of course Darwin and his, finches, he saw that their beaks changed their length and their width and their, overall shape over time. And so if that can happen in a population of birds, if that population of birds is changing, then these species are changing over time. Therefore, in their minds, the Bible would be wrong. But again, whenever we see examples of the Bible supposedly being proven wrong, it's because either you're using bad science or you're misinterpreting the Bible. And in this case, it's the latter. So people believe the Bible taught that species do not change over time. But that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says that species reproduce after their kinds. So it doesn't mean that a certain kind of animal can't change somewhat. It just means that you'll never get one kind of animal transforming over time into a brand new kind of animal. Doesn't matter how long you give a population of birds, they're never going to transform into a bear or something like that. Doesn't matter how many millions of years or natural selection you have going on there. So we call that a straw man argument, where you say something that's true, you tear this idea of fixity of species down. That's absolutely correct. Fixity of species is not a thing. Species change over time. That's 100% true. But the Bible doesn't teach that. So they're saying fixity of species is wrong, therefore the Bible is wrong. Well, these two things are not connected. The Bible doesn't teach that. So we call that a straw man argument. Go ahead and write down this bullet point, please. One thing that I want to make sure you don't think as we go forward here, and we talk about natural selection and how natural selection is all about small changes, I don't want you to think that natural selection can only give you changes that are, really, really insignificant. You can get rather large changes through the process of natural selection. If you would go back in time 200 years, you would not see anywhere near the variety of dogs that we have in our world today. Dog breeding did start a while before that, but it didn't really get kicked into gear until the 1800s, especially in the UK. And as a process of selectively breeding different dogs for different purposes, like if you have a beagle, they've got amazing noses, they can smell anything. Retrievers obviously were bred to bring back birds and things that were being hunted. Each of these different variety of dogs were bred with a different purpose in mind. And you can see what happened over just a couple different kinds of dogs that, not kinds, I should say, a couple different, types of dogs that existed 200 years ago, just selectively breeding them over the last, couple centuries, you have this huge variety of different types of dogs. So natural selection can give you lots and lots and lots of change. But what it can't ever get you is something that's completely different. Doesn't matter how long you breed dogs and how many different types of characteristics you're trying to specialize them in. As long as you're breeding dogs, you're only going to get dogs out of that. You could be doing this for 1,000 more years and end up with more breeds of dogs, but you're never going to end up with a breed of something else. Natural selection has limits. Even though you can have these huge changes taking place, you'll never have something other than a dog if all you're breeding are dogs. Write this down too, please. So up to this point, we've been talking about kinds and species, and you probably have gathered by now that they're different things. You know, a kind of animal is different from a species of animal. So the real question that we want to talk about here is, what is the Bible talking about when it refers to kinds of animals? Because it refers to them in that way a lot in Genesis 1. You know, during the creation of the world, we're talking about, you know, these animals reproducing after their kind. So what is a kind? And that's what we're going to define right here, right now. And you can write this one down too. This might be the last thing you're writing down today. So.
Title.
Yep. And that was the title of the last one too.
I didn't because it was at the bottom.
Oh, that's fine.
Nice.
Yeah, that's all right.
So, it'll just go into the other notes.
That's fine. Or put it off to the side.
This means hybrid. Have hybrid.
Yeah. If they can make little baby animals together, then they are the same kind.
16 3/4.
That sounds good. So the way that we would define a kind in terms of what the Bible has plainly told us, if creatures can reproduce according to their kinds, then if they can reproduce together, they are the same kind. So that's what these first two definitions kind of bring together there. And what this means in terms of the ark is when we look at, because we don't think of things as kinds, we don't define them that way in our biology classes, right? You've got species and genus and family and on up the ladder there. So what this means then is that generally a kind of animal will correspond to what we refer to in the taxonomic world as the family level. Sometimes it's lower, down to the genus level, but that's a good rule of thumb to go by there. And going by this definition, then, you would not need, there are millions upon millions of species of animals in the world. There's no way that you could fit every single species on the ark. But you don't need every species on the ark. You need every kind of animal. And when you go by that definition, you would end up with about 7,000 total animals aboard Noah's Ark. You would not have a wolf and a coyote and a dog. Back then, there was one dog-like creature from which those other animals eventually developed through natural selection, just like you got all the different breeds of dogs through natural selection. You did not need a brown bear and a black bear and a polar bear and a grizzly bear on the ark. There was one original bear kind from which those other bears eventually developed. Same with cats. There's probably just one cat kind on the ark, from which domesticated cats and tigers and lions and leopards have eventually come. And we know that because all of those things can interbreed. So again, you've got your classes of taxonomic definitions there. And it's pretty crazy when you think about it, because in terms of Noah's Ark, you would think that a lot of these creatures, there's no way that they could hybridize together and have offspring. But in reality, a lot of different creatures can have kids that you might not think of. This is a wolfen. A whale and a dolphin can have little babies together, and they are wolfens.
A lion and a tiger.
Yep, a lion and a tiger. A liger is a real thing. And so what that means then is those two cat creatures come from the original same cat kind back in the day. And you can mix a zebra and a donkey and get yourself a zonkey. So these two creatures, you did not have a zebra and a donkey on the ark. You had one original, horse-like creature from which all the other horses that we see in the world today have developed through the process of natural selection. So does speciation support evolution and contradict the Bible? No. Species can change over time. Nobody argues that. Sometimes very quickly, like in the case of dogs. All these different breeds of dogs came about mostly in the last 200 years. But they always remain the same kind of creature, even if the scientific community gives them a new species name. So we've gone through many examples already, and I'm just going to, one more for you here, right? So the genetic process behind speciation, or natural selection, whatever you want to call it, involves the sorting and recombination of existing genetic information. Speciation involving adaptation to a particular environmental niche requires the elimination of individuals not suited to that particular niche. You don't have to write this down, but I'm going to circle a word that's super important. When you're talking about natural selection, when you're talking about speciation, when you're talking about the small changes that are occurring within different kinds of animals, those changes occur as a result of eliminating the versions of those animals that are not well suited to that particular environment. And that process of elimination will never get you new information, but new information is what you need for the big story of evolution. So we talked about the, dogs with short hair and long hair. The genetic information for short hair would be lost if you're in a cold environment, and that results in a net loss of genetic information. So here's the thing. I've been kind of railing against evolution here. I mean, that's kind of what this class is all about, I guess, isn't it? But if you're a university professor, you would get in so much trouble for saying the stuff that I've been saying over the last 2 class periods. You would lose your job, you would lose funding, you would not get any more research grants, you would be out of there. But a lot of university professors realize and believe the same things I've been telling you here, because it's real science. This is what real science is telling us. But they know they can't say it while they're working there because they'd get fired and they'd lose tenure. So what a lot of them do is they speak up after they've retired. Like this individual, Professor David Gellertner, Yale University. He had a nice long quote that I'm going to read you to kind of wrap up today. Credit for this goes to Paul Kohlmorgen. He sent me this article that talked about what he had to say. I think it was back in 2019, so props to him for sending that in my direction. So Professor Gellertner says this: "My argument is with people who dismiss intelligent design without considering. It seems to me it's widely dismissed in my world of academia as some sort of theological put-up job. It's an absolutely serious scientific argument. In fact, it's the first and most obvious intuitive one that comes to mind. It has to be dealt with intellectually." And he goes on. "Their intellectual behavior, what they have published, and more importantly, what they tell their students," he's talking about his colleagues, of course, "Darwinism has indeed passed beyond a scientific argument as far as they are concerned. You take your life into your hands to challenge it intellectually. They will destroy you if you challenge it." This is a Yale University professor talking here. "What I have seen in their behavior intellectually at colleges across the West is nothing approaching free speech on this topic. It's a bitter, fundamental, angry, outraged rejection which comes nowhere near scientific or intellectual discussion. I've seen that happen again and again. I'm attacking their religion. Religion is imparted, and young people are brought up as little Darwinists, people who believe in evolution like it's their religion. Kids I see running around New Haven, which is the campus at Yale, are all Darwinists. The students I see in my class, they're all Darwinists. I am not hopeful." Gellertner cites the Cambrian explosion as an insurmountable problem facing Darwinism because the fossil record shows a striking variety of new organisms, including the very first ever animals, pop up suddenly in the fossil record. This directly contradicts the expectation by Darwin that new life forms evolve gradually from old ones in a constantly branching, spreading tree of life, which we've been talking about. The grand story of evolution, the general theory of evolution, however you want to word that. And this is the end of his quote here then. "There's no reason to doubt that Darwin successfully explained the small adjustments by which an organism adapts to local circumstances, changes to fur density or wing style or beak shape. That's natural selection. It's a thing. It's true. Yet there are many reasons to doubt whether he can answer the hard questions and explain the big picture. Not the fine-tuning of existing species, but the emergence of new ones. The origin of species is exactly what Darwin cannot explain." I think that's a very powerful statement. I think that's a really good spot for us to stop for the day. Pick it up there tomorrow.